Ladies and gentlemen, dear Branko, thank you very much for this wonderful invitation. In these days I learn so much, and I hope that my English will not be too bad in the next in the maximum 40 minutes. I want to give you now the lesson about the ethical significance of the infinity and otherness of God and the understanding of man as inspired subject. Emmanuel Levinas, ladies and gentlemen, is really a challenge for Christian theology. And I start with a remark. In Catholic theology, we know the rule of the so-called analogous talking about God, analogia, which was verbalized in the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. We cannot express a similarity between God and creature without mentioning an even bigger dissimilarity. This is the definition of this council. We cannot talk about a similarity between God and man without noting a bigger dissimilarity. The famous also phenomenological thinker and theologian Karl Rahner, shortly before he died, reflected if he, as theologian in his life, has thought about this. If we are talking about God in our everyday business, make with the people feel that we talk about the Deus semper maior, a God who is greater than we can think of him. Or bring me the impression up that you can talk about God as I can talk about my clock or a house or a building. So in my opinion, Emmanuel Levinas is a thinker who can teach us, we can learn from him, to take the rule of analogous talk about God more seriously and to incorporate it to a greater extent in our day-to-day business than we sometimes manage in our field of study. How do we cope with the remaining incomprehensibility of the talking about God without jeopardizing the significance of biblical speech about God? And it's interesting that this dissimilarity is also held in a Christological context. Now I go 4 steps with you. The first, Levinas and the question of the meaning of life, critical thinking and responsibility in light of the problems of our time and in light of the problems of the 20th century. Levinas' thinking is, as we heard in the last days, strongly influenced by the both world wars, Nazi oppression, and the Shoa, during which nearly his whole family was murdered and extinguished. Due to the incomprehensible pain and the mass murderous extermination of human life, he struggles with the question of God, of man, of goodness. This illustrates that the question of theodicy is as dramatically touched as the doctrine of God, theological anthropology, and ethical philosophy from a systematic theological point of view. And it shows also that there is a deep dependence between biography and philosophy and thinking. We are thinking about what happens between us in the time, in the history, about all these questions, about luck and suffering. This is what we are thinking about. In the context of a so-called post-Auschwitz theology, which cannot simply go back to day-to-day business after the catastrophes, Levinas becomes a valuable and essential interlocutor. Not only was he globally received as a philosopher, but as an important advocate of Judeo-Christian dialogue. He was repeatedly invited to Rome by Pope John Paul II, and Pope Francis knows about Levinas' theories also through the reception of liberation theology. Levinas was inspired by the Bible of Israel and Hebrew thought. Hebrew thought differs in his side from Greek philosophy and its idea of an immortal soul. It deals with temporality and physical condition of mortal human beings in an alternative approach. Levinas liked to compare both theories to Abraham and Ulysses. He says Abraham leaves his secure home and travels to an unknown remoteness without speculating about the return. Likewise, Ulysses leaves his home and experiences many adventures. But other than Abraham, he comes back to himself. He comes back to his home after every adventure. Levinas says he represents the human being who is received as a self-reflecting subject, always coming back to me, not so far away, no risk, not no risk, no fun, yes, no risk, but I have to go out, I have to leave, which in a state of self-reflection and self-confidence manages to revert to the self and to bundle outer influences within. Whereas in Levinas' opinion, Abraham represents the biblical anthropology, in which mankind lives through time and according to God's promise, and awaits an open future, as it is promised in the book of Exodus and the other books of the so-called Old, or we say in Germany, First Testament, the first and the second. The second step, the idea of the infinite ethically turned over universal responsibility. To Levinas, the idea of the infinite in metaphysics is most clearly depicted, as he says, by the well-known philosopher René Descartes. Naturellement. Descartes managed to depict the relationship between the self and the infinite as a separation. So Levinas wants to attribute theoretical thinking about existence and the idea of the infinite to a significance which is not based on the light of reason, but still is not irrational and thus is ethically important, by using the phenomenological method. The idea of infinity means the separation of the self and the other. This separation opens up a space between us, entre nous. It opens up the time and symbolizes a relationship of proximity, of approximation in independence. Furthermore, it constructs the thinking and inwardness of the subject. Accordingly, this relation is characterized by an asymmetry. The subject sees itself confronted with an infinity that is not only based on inner thought, but rather refers to an incarnate consciousness, which directly, immediately encounters the other. And if you allow me this remark, Levinas reads the books of Genesis. And in a Jewish way, and also in a Christian way, the first dialogues in the Holy Scripture is an asymmetric dialogue between God and the first man. And this is a not symmetric situation. And there comes the diachronia. And this is important. It's a very, very interesting kind of reading and interpreting the Bible. The dialogue begins with this infinite dialogue. The subject sees itself confronted with an infinity that is not only based on inner thought, but rather refers to an incarnate consciousness which directly encounters the other. According to Levinas, experience only deserves its name if it exceeds our nature. Experience inevitably needs to lead to the other, to transcendence. To encounter otherness excludes any reduction of the other towards the self. The idea of the infinite is the only idea, so Levinas, which teaches us something that we do not already know. He says, the infinite is posed within us. It's not a memory. We have an experience in the only radical meaning of the word, a relationship with the outer, the other, without being able to integrate it within the self. The thinker who carries the thought of the infinite is more than just himself, and this addition does not come from within. So, quotation, Levinas nevertheless manages to talk about experience, an experience of the other in a sense of fundamental passiveness. We heard about it this morning also. He talks about an experience that cannot acquire the other and does not manage to integrate it into the horizon of consciousness. the thinking thinks more than it actually can think. That is a paradox also. Levinas says, experience and the idea of infinite proves itself within the frame of relation to the other. The idea of the infinite symbolizes a social relationship. This relation means the approximation to an outer being. Being on the outside manifests itself in a complete resistance, which the other, in its epiphany, sets against any capability of the self, a resistance, an ethical resistance. This resistance does not take place in an abstract thinking, which achieves to conquer any resistance. The epiphany of the ultimate other is not a vision of a sensuous or intelligible form in the light of reason, but rather the no, which is hurled at the capability of the subject, the no. Levinas says its logos is, you shalt not kill. You shalt not kill. Levinas adopts the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, and puts the prohibition of killing in focus. This is the ethical resistance between the self and the other. You will not have me at your disposal. Levinas also connects this thought with aniconism. You shall not make for yourself an idol of God, and you shall not make an idol of me, of the other. I cannot imagine an idol of the other because he is characterized by an incomprehensibility which exceeds any imagination. To force the other into an image which I have visualized of him forces a violence on him that robs him of his transcendence. The condition of mankind, which represents a transition from the order of being into an order beyond of being, is sensibility, sensuousness, and bodiliness. It is through these that the subject can manage to be out of itself. Through these, the subject can directly, immediately encounter the neighbor as another, from which it receives sense and meaning. Levinas says, this which immediately makes sense, even before it is given to it, that is thy neighbor. This is where the meaning of sensuousness lies. An immediate sense can be received through it, which cannot be destructed or deduced from a consciousness of the self. Significance, meaning is received by the other. The other does not gain its meaning by the self, but through himself, which means that he gains an unvariable meaning and dignity. This is the dignity of man. This is the exact meaning of the face of the other. This face of the other is not a phenomenon, but rather self-importance par excellence, par excellence. It does neither receive its meaning through the self, nor by a totality of sense, or a system, or a philosophy. Levinas follows the thought of unicity radically. Every human being is unique, incomparable, individual, indefensible. Unicity describes an inaccessible and immediate meaning of every person, which is not due to human ascription. No one can deny another's meaning and dignity, because we know how often the dignity is destroyed in our time through violence and war. And I think just in our crazy times, this philosophy has an impact. No one can deny another's meaning and dignity like it is the case in a totalitarian system or in ideologies which even want to decide when a human is a human and when humanness is denied. When is life worthful that it can be lived? And can man decide about the worth of the living of the other? Is perverse. This means killing someone else. According to Levinas, the importance of mankind is out of the question. The face of the self is the source of sense. Its significance is absolute. It is detached from any attribution of meaning by the subject or a system. In German we say unverfügbar. I don't know now the English expression. It's nicht verfügbar. It's not in my might, in my mightiness. Yes. Thank you. This cannot be without consequence for reasoning. Ethical resistance opens up the dimension of infinity, which sets bounds to the compelling imperialism of the self, which wants to control and design everything, in our time. PCs, artificial intelligence, we want to design everything. Perhaps also human mind, and so on. And there is a resistance which sets bounds to the compelling imperialism of the self. Ethical resistance symbolizes the presence of the infinite. To the self, it signifies the injustice of its imperialistic thoughts towards the other. Levinas says that is why the other is not just another freedom. To know about the injustice means to have a view out of the dimension of the ideal. The other has to be closer to God than the self. So Levinas. This is by no means an invention of philosophy, but rather a givenness of moral consciousness, which could be determined as the consciousness of the priority of the other over the self. World-perceived justice starts with the other, so says Levinas. Levinas once summarized his philosophy very simply, also in a dialogue I had with him. He said it again. My philosophy in short words is, après vous, messieurs, après vous, madame, after you, my lady, after you, sir. Of course, I made the experience with my friend Reinhard Esterbauer. If you have two Levinas fans standing before an open door, and you make this, it can take 2 or 3 hours if you can go through the door, because everyone says to you, after you, après vous, and then you have to decide immediately, yes, and not make a long reflection. That is immediacy in your life. You go on and don't reflect, and the next time the après vous will hit yourself. So, this après vous, this ethical relationship with the other, is the basis and not a superstructure of awareness. The other precedes me. He is already in the world when I am born. And God bless you. And I follow him. Others have decided that I should come into existence. Even before I can reflect up it, I am confronted with the other. That is why the idea of the infinite, in which the conscious thinks more than it actually cannot be understood as a matter of contemplation. Beyond desires, besoin, like hunger and thirst, which can be met, to Levinas there also exists a desire, désir, desiderium, for the absolute other which cannot be met and fulfilled. This desire is unappeasable and thus is witness to the otherness of the other. The desired cannot be reached. The yearning is about the other that cannot be co-opted. It moves otherness into a sphere of the sublime, so says Levinas. That is how free will is empowered to goodness or benevolence. Levinas says the structure of free will, which transforms into benevolence, is no longer similar to the conceited and modest spontaneity of the self and of luck, which are perceived as outer movements of existence. In relation to this, a volition which transformed into goodness is, so to speak, an inversion. The life of freedom, which in itself discovered to be unjustified, the life of the freedom of heteronomy, only exists within a never-ending movement that constantly doubts itself, takes in question. That is how the depth of inwardness reveals itself. The intensification of responsibility increases insistence. Within this construct, freedom does not have the last word. I never rediscover myself in loneliness, or to put it differently, the moral consciousness is unmet. There is always a certain desire, so says Levinas. The subject constantly compares itself to the idea of the infinite, which doubts the self-assertion of the self, and thus always feels a certain feeling of injustice and imperfection. There is a certain feeling of shame, which freedom perceives itself to be because it acts like a usurpatoric. Freedom represents a moral life which is bound by diachronic heteronomy. Ethical consciousness precedes freedom. Levinas interprets the dissatisfaction of moral consciousness as a contraction, as a retraction of consciousness in itself, and at a so-called systole of the same, diastole, systole. This, ladies and gentlemen, insinuates the biological, the physical image of heart, but also the biblical perception of the heart. In biblical anthropology, the heart is the center of man, and I can only understand it in a body sense, incorporated sense, not only as abstract mind. Heart is the center of the flesh of man. Levinas conceives creation as a means of giving the other space and withdrawing oneself. This is a reception of the Jewish mystic in Kabbalah, the so-called Tzimtzum, where Jewish mysticism says that the creation was not an expansion of God, but God drew himself back for making place for the other. This is the thought in Levinas. The movement of the idea of the infinite means contraction, and this contraction is even more fundamental than the freedom which opens up the environment for it. God commands people by putting us in contact with people who require our action. This is the only fashion in which Levinas even dares to speak of mediation. Mediation implies that the free person is dedicated to their neighbor and that no one can save themselves without the help of the other. This is precisely where Levinas draws from the biblical legacy and Jewish tradition. Third step. The trace of the infinite and the human being as an image of God. The trace of God, who did not expand himself in creation, but rather retreated in order to give the world its needed space, disrupts the order of the world. The mystery of transcendence and mankind involves from this trace. This mystery is the manner in which the Absolute performs. The traces of God in the time disrupt synchronization. Also, the traces cave in the idea of the infinite as a symbol of immemorial past. Still existing questionability and mysteriousness shape the existence of human being, which cannot explain everything in the world. He can also not explain the sense of suffering in the time, but nevertheless, he has to act and to make decisions, even if I don't know all what I would like to know if I make an important decision. To leave traces, so Levinas means to pass by, to decamp, to self-absolve. Exodus, going out. Levinas interprets transcendence as a passing, passé, en France, as the passing, ce passé of transcendence in an immemorial past, passé, as past. Saying this, Levinas has the passing of God, like in Pesach, in mind, which the Bible talks about in Exodus 33. God is passing by Moses in the time, a passing of God. The transcendence of God left its traces in the time. These traces are a bond of the absolute other. They imply the merging of time and space, the point where the world yields to past and future. Transcendence happens outside the differentiation of to be and being, as en France, il. In German, jener. It's difficult to say it in English. This one beyond the relation from I and you. Il, ileity. So I speak now about the term ileity also in the English version. Levinas says only a being that transcends the world can leave a trace in the world. The trace symbolizes the presence of him who was actually not there, of someone that had always passed. It does not lead to the past, but it's a changing into a past that is more distant than all of the past and all of the future, which still belong to the presence of the self. A changing into the past of the other, in which eternity becomes apparent, the absolute past that unites all time, so Levinas. The movement of the transcendence happens in the face of the neighbor. It is through itself transcendence and affliction because it is within the trace of the ileity. The ileity is the origin of the otherness. The self gets closer to the infinite by approaching a you that is his contemporary. In the trace of the similarity, however, the you walks up to me from the depths of an uncatchable past. The self gets closer to the infinite to the same degree as it forgets itself for the neighbor. Levinas says, I only forget myself by breaking through the unalterable simultaneity of perception, of imagination, by existing beyond my own death. I get closer to infinity by sacrificing myself. The sacrifice is the degree and the norm of the approximation, and the truth of transcendence lies in the fact that language, speech, and action should be reconciled. The sacrifice symbolizes the possibility of self-sacrifice for the other, and this can lead up to giving one's own life for the other. This is the extremely form of self-communication in the time. That happens between ourselves and gives us something to think about. What is the meaning if one gives his time or his life for the other man? What does it mean? It happens between us. What is the meaning? It's not the preaching of a sacrifice. It is thinking about a sacrifice which takes place in human life all over the times. In every time, people gave her life for other people. And what's the meaning of this? This is for me a very interesting link to think then about Christology, out from such thinking. The sacrifice, the possibility of giving oneself, here Levinas speaks about the God-likeness, the imago Dei, the image of God, the human being as image of God. He says, the God who went past is not the archetype of which the face would be the reflection. Being the image of God does not mean being an icon of God, but being situated in his trace. The God, so Levinas, of our Judeo-Christian spirituality, who revealed himself, keeps the whole infinity of his absence, that itself is in the personal order. He only shows himself in his trace, like in chapter 33 of Exodus. Approaching him does not mean following this trace. That is not a sign, but approaching the others that remain within this trace of God. The erectitude of the trace, erectitude, lies in the fact that it commands the self in his longing for the good, for God, to the other, and thus infers a longing onto the neighbor. And ladies and gentlemen, if you allow this remark, this example, how revelation happens in Exodus 33, that God is going by, the presence happens, but I can't think about the presence in the same moment. God leaves time, opens time for me, and I can recognize him only afterwards, after the presence happened. After this presence happened between us, we can think about it. And so we have a space of time which is opened. And this paradigm is also the paradigm how the New Testament will speak about the revelation of Christ. The story of the disciples in Emmaus is exactly the same phenomenon. If Jesus is with the disciples, they don't realize. But if he is absent, then afterwards they realize what happened. It's exactly the phenomenon of Exodus 33, because talking about Jesus in New Testament as revelation finds its legitimation for the text of New Testament only in the Old Testament. Because this is the word of God for Jesus Christ and for the Christians, and so the legitimation for New Testament revelation theology lies in the Old Testament. So it's no question that it remains important in the relationship to the other. He is not established as an object. His meaning is not set up. It is a matter of the immediate touch to unicity that attains its distinction not through a system, universality or totality, but its attributed meaning of its own accord. The immediacy of the contact does not imply a spatial bordering of one another that would be apparent to a third person, but it is the proximity itself that attributes meaning of its own accord. Due to the proximity, the intentional turns into ethics. The ethical signifies a turn of subjectivity. The subjectivity that is open for the entities for the purpose of perception turns back into a subjectivity that comes into contact with an absolute and unconceivable singularity, which excludes every thematization and imagination and allows no comparing between us. The one man is better, the other man is not so good. I cannot compare the one and the other, because every man not only has a value, but is the value. If you talk about values, the basic value is man. This is the reason we are talking about. Levinas says, here we have the original language, the foundation of the other languages, where this transition of the intentional into the ethical takes place and does not cease to take place, where the approaching breaks through consciousness, where that happens. Right there is skin and human face and touch. The touch means tenderness and responsibility. Also, Pope Francis spoke about the revolution of tenderness. It's very interesting. In German, the Revolution der Zärtlichkeit. Levinas thinks of language as a contact of the incarnate subject in which the touch breaks through consciousness in its intentionality. Solely because of that, it can be spoken of immediate proximity that is not mediated through consciousness or its imagination. It's not surprising that Levinas makes reference to the immediacy of the sensual and brings it to mind as an incident of proximity. The immediacy of the sensual consists of the fact that the sensual touch in the close proximity cannot be attributed to an experience of proximity. The example of the caress becoming apparent with physical touch without changing its meaning into an experience of caress thus illustrates the immediacy of the proximity without intention. The immediacy is another thing as the experience of this immediacy. Levinas says this relationship of proximity, this contact that cannot be converted into noetic, noemetic structures, and that already is the wherein for all transmissions of messages, is the original language. Language, speech without words or sentences, pure communication. Language for Levinas is proximity, the kind how we live our proximity, if we talk to each other or if we touch us. And this is only possible if we are separated, you and me. And then it's interesting what happens between us. I ask not for an identity, but for the relation entre nous, between us. In a language understood just like that, language as self-communication, the other immediately holds meaning before it is given to him. The immediacy arises from the proximity that the self is exposed to. The proximity between the separated skips consciousness, not due to a lack, but due to a surplus of proximity. The surplus of proximity means that it always has an anachronistic presence in relation to consciousness. Only in hindsight we can catch the meaning of the presence that has passed just now, and that we can only interpret later on. Consciousness is always later, when having a rendezvous with the neighbor. It chases after an absolutely elusive meaning that it has not constituted itself. The neighbor is not made to measure of consciousness. With reference to consciousness as a passive work of time, experience of time means for Levinas becoming older against my willing. I become older and older. This is experience of time. Not the time I'm thinking about, but the time which changes me, also my body. I look older as 10 years ago. This is why new industries make many money with making your face better, as it perhaps could be. I stay to my face. With reference to consciousness as a passive work of time, a passiveness that is more passive than all passiveness, like the passiveness of creation. Levinas asserts that such consciousness cannot be characterized with categories of intentionality. It rather means that human speech occurs as proximity and touch. In language, the other is not made the subject of discussion, but he is approached. The proximity of the other means a break in the presence, absence in the presence, a presence that cannot be envisioned as proximity of the other, who is the absolute, the absent, whom consciousness cannot envision. Here, the biblical tension of God's immanence in the time and God's transcendence appears. Also in Christian theology, we have to hold both God in the world, infinite, and God as the other, beyond the world, infinite. The double meaning of infinition. The self cannot make up the surplus meaning of the other, in which infinity announces itself. A relationship without simultaneity, diachrony. The presence of the other receives its order from the non-place, from the absence in which the infinite advances. Its order is based on the trace of its own progress and is organized according to my love and my responsibility. The self itself turns into a sign. Signifiance en français means for Levinas, I become the sign of this trace of God. I do not talk about signs or expression. I am the sign for the other. Language means fraternity, sisterity, means responsibility for the other and hence responsibility for what I have not committed, also for the pain and the mistakes of the other. The subject is responsible for everyone. One can take responsibility for all. This is the biblical motive that what one man lives and what one man is doing can have an importance for all. The link between universal and individual election and thinking. Levinas develops a messianic conception of responsibility. What someone does can be meaningful for everyone and change the world. The messianism starts with myself, with me, as a vulnerable human being capable of suffering. Also, if I say it from a Christian point of view, if I take serious the mankind of Jesus, Jesus is really man, not really God, but really man. And so it's interesting, what can you make then in Christology in this dialogue with Levinas? The messianism starts with myself. The proximity of the infinite symbolizes responsibility. It symbolizes endless passiveness and the inability to withdraw oneself from one's responsibility and desertedness, in which infinity symbolizes absence. I am exposed and subjected to the other, an exposed existence. This is my election. And now the first and the last, and then I will finish soon. I hope I'm in the time still. Okay, thank you. According to Levinas, the body and not consciousness turns into an organ of transcendence. The body is the enabling of my thinking, the enabling of my feeling, the enabling of my being able to talk. Without body, I would not stand here. And this means the body is organ of transcendence. The sensuousness turns into a place where meaning is received. Transcendence can only occur in the physical act and not in mere imagination. Through the body, the self is responsible for the world, because the body is my connection with the world, with evolution. In my body there are traces of evolution. In my body there is a history. In a certain way, my family, all who were before us, that's all in my body. I'm connected with all in my body. Perhaps also after my death, I will be connected with all. This, through the body, the self is responsible for the world. The passiveness of being incarnated implies a responsibility that I am appointed to before every relationship that I can choose freely. The freedom arises from a responsibility and a choice, a chosenness that in a diachronic sense precedes the freedom. I cannot escape this responsibility. I cannot make excuses if the other is commanded to me and needs my help. responsibility signifies freedom. Levinas says requirement that exceeds possession, but that enables giving. Recurrence that is incarnation, and in which the body, which enables giving, is changed without becoming estranged, because this other is the heart and the goodness, the self, the inspiration, or simply the psychism of the soul. The psychism of the soul. The words inspiration and psychism are chosen deliberately from Levinas. The phenomena of air and breathing are of outstanding importance for Levinas. Phenomenologically, this, for one thing, is once again illustrated through language. I cannot talk to you without breathing. It's not possible. So when what is said is traced back, reduced to speech, what is said is thus traced back to breathing. The breath of speech opens me up to the other. Breathing as an image of becoming open, not making me close, but open me. This one. Speech symbolizes the only way in which the incarnated self and the other can immediately come close to each other without using violence. They have all the same breath, the same spirit, the same in Hebrew, ruach, because this is the biblical motive that if the Holy Scripture is talking about the Spirit, it's in Hebrew ruach, and ruach means in Hebrew breath, wind, storm, and not intellectuality, not mind. Levinas adopts this biblical context and also the bodiliness of myself. This is the importance of breathing. The openness for the self, for the other, signifies a relationship that does not imply to arrange oneself, but to breath. The first human being in the book of Genesis is given respiration by God. The so-called Adam, the picture, the metaphor for the first man, is inspirated, breathed by God. And this is the picture. The inspirated subject, who is opened for the other, who has this breath in the center of my heart, of their own identity. It means, so Levinas, to open oneself up like space, to free oneself through breathing from the closedness within oneself. Levinas speaks of the psychism of the soul, that is understood as the phase-shifting of human identity as the other within me. The time in which I meet the other is expanded between the I and the self I have to become in time. Time and otherness happen within me, in my dynamic identity. Identity is never static, it's only dynamic. The incarnated ability to goodness derives from the other and is extended to become physically tangible goodness. Without this heteronomy, Levinas cannot envision freedom as responsibility. The subject is not identical to himself. There is a rupture in me, in the relation between the I that has to become itself in the time. And in this time, the neighbor is encountered. And I have no choice. I cannot avoid this. The discrepancy within himself symbolizes the temporal relationship to the other, that is lived in the flesh, in the body, and was opened by the other and by the infinite in an immemorial past, creation. This is how incarnate transcendence can happen for the other in existence, which implies a nuclear fusion of the self. This, however, requires a word beyond, by inspiration through the other. Closeness of the other means inspiration up to the end, to breathing one's last breath in the death. It takes, so says Levinas, a great persistence to have a long breath. For a long way run, I have a breath. Now I come to the end. The self Identity signifies bearing physically witness of the glory of the infinite. The glory of the infinity is the subject's anarchic identity of the scared, of the expelled who cannot evade his expulsion. According to Levinas, God's revelation occurs through the person that receives the revelation, through the inspired subject. Levinas, in an interview, once referred to the gospel according to Matthew 25, you quoted us this morning. Matthew 25, the question, when have I met Jesus in the human beings who need my help? And I finish with these words of Levinas. He says, indeed, I would say to the same extent as I state it, that the relationship to the other is the beginning of all understandability, that I cannot describe the relationship to God without speaking of what makes me feel responsible towards the other. Every time that I talk, so Levinas, to a Christian, I quote Matthew 25. There, the relationship to God is presented as a relationship to another human being. This is not a metaphor, says Levinas. God is actually present in our neighbor. I hear the word of God through my relationship with the other. This is not a metaphor. This is extremely important. It is literally true. I do not say that the neighbor is God, so Levinas, but that I hear the word of God in this face. And that signifies, according to Levinas, ethic. Ethic means the immediate relation and vision of the other's face without mediation. So the dialogue with Emmanuel Levinas' thought can help theology to take the analogous talking about God seriously, which I gave you at the starting of my lecture. To respect the more greater dissimilarity and incomprehensibility and understand analogy as responsibility in the messianic sense, here, look at me, you have got me here, or as the prophecy says in Hebrew, hineni, I am the sign for this responsibility. Thank you for listening.
Erwin, thank you very much for this very engaging lecture. You incorporated, in some sense, the thought of Levinas. So thank you very much. I'm happy we still have some time for discussion because I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions. Yes, I'm ready. Okay. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm happy that you brought Levinas in connection with the breath and the ruach of spirit and breath. I think it's, of course, in the otherwise and being, in the end, he especially emphasizes the question of the breath as the openness, and he talks about this long breath. And then he speaks about the spirit much, but is there actually in Levinas some kind of, anywhere in his work, some kind of explication where he makes truly explicit his thinking of the this respiratory openness connected to the question of ethics and opening up for the other? Because it's kind of, at least in my understanding, I'm not a Levinas expert in any kind of way, it kind of stays implicit and it stays kind of in this kind of speech of the spirit, which then, for most people who just read the spirit, they don't connect it with breath at all. They connect it with kind of this kind of normal senses of spirit that we have. And they don't have this idea that you should always think the ruach, that it's the breath. The same thing is the translation of the Bible. We should maybe translate the Bible totally new, and every time we use the word there, spirit, it should have also the breath there. So it would completely start to kind of incarnate that idea of the breath as the openness in a totally new level. I think I have written my PhD on breathing and phenomenological ontology of breathing, and that's why it kind of like opens. So I think somehow maybe Levinas's ethics needs to be rethought in an explicit manner from this, like what would be the ethics of breathing or its opening up of the, or what do you
Yes,
like?
thank you for this remark. And in my knowledge of the books of Levinas, I would say that the most remarks concerning the context you questioned is in Autrement qu'être au-delà des sens. And in this book, in his late great, here he has a chapter, a whole chapter, and many reflections where he wants to show this link between the biblical, talking about breathing, breath, ruach, and the ethical significance. And there is the phenomenon of recurrence. Recurrence, in France, récurrence, that I come back to myself, and that if I want to, I say it now in my words, I excuse all expense here for his banality, if I want to find myself in my heart and in my inwardness, I not only find the infinite or the other outside of my body, but I find the other in my body depth, in the depth of my body, because the breathing divides my lung, and the systole and the diastole of my heart is the movement to take something from me and to give something.
So
A rhythm of life, if you want to say it in this. I'm also singing in chorus, and so it's the perhaps also an example of music where we can see that breathing enables to transcendence in voice, and what I'm singing or what I'm talking to someone can reach the other not only outside, and he is hearing something and says, okay, it doesn't, in German we say, it doesn't go under my skin. I don't know if it's functioned in English, but what the relation to the other concerns me in my inwardness. And that's the picture of breathing, as I understand it in Levinas, in Autrement qu'être ou au-delà des sens. Thank you for your remark.
Yes, we just try to have as many.
Sorry, it was too long.
No, it's okay, but it's fine. Please.
So I obviously agree that Levinas remains extremely important for contemporary philosophy and theology. I wonder, though, sometimes whether a completely uncritical appropriation of Levinas into Christian theology underplays his Jewishness as a thinker. And I think this is captured in the term Judeo-Christian, right, which for me remains highly ambiguous. So I guess my question for you is there anything that Christian theology cannot or should not accept from Levinas?
Very good and difficult question. Simply said, I brought the quotation of Matthew by Levinas. And it's aware to us all that, of course, Levinas did not believe in Jesus Christ. He has a Jewish faith. But if he says this in a Judeo-Christian dialogue group, there is the interview given, then he is open to say, I do not believe like you. And Jews and Christians have not the same faith, but they believe in the same God. And this is the importance of this quotation, that he can say, also, if I not believe in Jesus Christ as Messias or Son of God, as you do, I can say what is said here in the biblical context about this man and this messianic meaning of Jesus. And that you say, if Jesus is for you not only man, but also the Son of God. And you say, I cannot get my relation to God and to Jesus without the relation to the other. Then I say as Jew, what you are saying with Christology, I say without Christology. And so we have a difference, of course, between Jewish and Christian thinking in the meaning of Jesus Christ. That's very clear. that the Catholic Magistery, the Second Vatican Council, the Magistery of John Paul II, of Benedict XVI, of Francis say, and this is the dogmatic standpoint of Catholic meaning today, that we have to accept, so says this Benedict XVI, that the Jews have another election as the Christians, that the mission of Jews is impossible, because the Jews, as long as times and devils are in the valid covenant with God. And the covenant with God, so says Joseph Ratzinger as cardinal, before he was elected as pope, we have to accept that Jews and Christians, in a different way, are witnesses of the same truth of God. And this is my hermeneutic basic, why I can risk as a Christian dogmatic theologian to make a dialogue with Emmanuel Levinas in respect that he believes others as I do. This is the difference. But that he says the image of God is the common legacy of Jewish and Christian thinking. Also the New Testament, there is very important that the man as image of God is representative of God. Every man represents God. And this election can not be destroyed by sin. Never. Also the word sinner, this is Thomas Aquin, and the whole tradition of Catholic thinking remains an image of God. And here we have a common link between Jewish and Christian thinking in anthropology, that I can spoke Jewish Christian about man and the election of man, also if I know and respect the difference in a Christological or not Christological faith.
Michael?
Okay, I thought that was late. I'm interested in, well, what Levinas in Autre also discusses more toward the end, but which is something that haunts his whole idea of what he calls the impossibility of escaping God. So that means that God is something I find in my absolute passivity, which is something which opens me up in absolute passivity, which is something that happens by way of respiration.
Yes.
So the problem then is, and this is something he discusses toward the end of the book when he talks about the return of skepticism. He talks about the difficulty that discourse always, ever again, closes itself over its interruptions. So, of course, what he presents there is a difficult question of the ethical and the political. And my question would be what the thought of grief could help us in order to transpose this impossibility into the field of the political. Do you see? I mean, it's a oftentimes discussed topic in Levinas scholarship, but I haven't found any useful solution to the problem. I mean, how would you infuse the political with the ethical in terms that are really equivalent to what Levinas poses as the problem and as the question?
What I did not talk about is the meaning of the third person.
Exactly.
Yes, and there are elaborations about the third in its meaning for Levinas, because you know the relation between two, I and you, is characterized by the asymmetric way, because the other is earlier than I in the world, and I come and the others are already present. And then he says, if I come into a community or an elected people like Jews or Christians or other religions, then there are not only two, but there are three and many threes, sorry. the third and many people. And now, says Levinas, now comes the question of justice.
Exactly.
If I cannot compare the one with the other, how can I shine a judgment about the one or the other in a conflict? This is also a question of our church, mercy and justice. And in this moment, Levinas would say a community is grace because the third and the many thirds help me to share my responsibility with the other. If I am not able to help, you can do it for me. And now he says, if a society where many people are together always says, I see you have a problem and I should help you, but I have no time at this moment, there are enough other people that could help you. In my situation at the moment, I'm sorry. And this is Levinas. If a society is functioning like this, then I always say, I'm out of the game and you manage for me. And if a society forgets that also is a community with the third one is living together, I have to remember this asymmetric election. If the third becomes my excusing that I do nothing, then a society becomes inhuman. This is Levinas. The third helps me that we can share responsibility as a society, in the state, in the church, or whatever. But I may not forget my original responsibility. I am the first, also if there are other people, I am the first who should help the other. Perhaps this as an attempt to ask, to answer your question. Yes, thank you.
Reinhold?
I'd like to continue your question and to focus it on Christology. You maintain that there is a good relationship between Levinas and the Christian theology on what concerns the image of, to be the image of God and something like that. But do you think that there are categories of Levinas that you can receive as a Christian theologian, that are able to transform Christian Christology? Because the person of Christ, I think, is the crucial point between the relationship and the Judeo-Christian dialogue.
Yes. Yes. I take up the motive from my teacher, Joseph Wohlmuth, who said that in the text of the Council of Chalcedon, 451, this famous Christological Council, where the question was between the Alexandrine and the Antiochic theologians, is Jesus Christ a bit more God or a bit more man? Is God and mankind divided or a melting identity between the two? They had to decide, and this decision also had consequences in the dividing of certain groups in the church who did not go with it. But in the contemporary discussion in the German theology, this thinking of Chalcedon means I may not, in Christology, speak about the relation of God and man in Jesus Christ without separating them, but I may not mix them. So, there remains a difference also in Christology. I have no identity without difference between the Logos, the eternal Christ, and Jesus. But I have a unity in difference. And Joseph Wohlmuth says, this talking of Chalcedon about the unmixed relation is the Jewish legacy in Christian theology. I may not make a monophysitic Christology. I know that some theologians do a monophysitic Christology, where the Logos of God is more dominant than his mankind. And I try with Karl Rahner and Joseph Wohlmuth, with these questions Levinas poses me, that also in Christology we are talking about an asymmetric relation if we take serious that Jesus is radically Jew and man. And then we are thinking about what John Paul II said, that Jesus Christ was born in Israel and was born in the Jewish context, belongs to the truth of incarnation. So what does it mean? That we as Christians are linked together, are bound with the history and the people of Israel. And that we talk about Christology without abwerten.
Depreciate, depreciate, not appreciate, but
Yes.
depreciate.
that we speak about Jesus Christ
Devaluate.
and about salvation without depreciate or minder the faith of Israel. And this is the problem of Christology over years and years, that Christ brings the fulfillment and Jews are always not in the fulfillment. And I learned from Levinas and also from the magisterium of our church, from the Vatican II and the last Pope. If we speak about Christology today, we cannot make this in a way that appreciates the Jewish election, which means also the very conservative Cardinal Gerd Ludwig Müller writes in his big dogmatics that the people of Israel, the Jewish people, have an immediate relation to God because of the covenant which remains valid also as the Jews are not able to believe in Jesus Christ. And we know that St. Paul also has a problem in the letter to the Romans, and where he says, whole Israel will be saved. I don't know why and how, because we should believe in Christ. Isn't it? Only our explicit belief brings our salvation. But St. Paul is aware that if I say this, and he knows that he is Jew and remains Jew and Jesus was Jew, that if he would say this, also the Jews are only saved if they are explicit in the faith to Christ. That he excludes all these people out of the salvation will of God. And then St. Paul says, no, I can't do it. I cannot exclude anyone out of the relation to God in the name of God. I can't do it. And so I have the hope all will be saved. And this is the attempt as an answer to your question. I must make Christology in a way that not violates the Jewish respect in its own election. That is the consequence.
I have to stop at this point. I thank you once again for your engagement and for all the answers in the lecture. I think we have to applaud.